So we're going to get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. This is the what you need to know about the tax fight, lessons from last time, and why it is time to close the carried interest loophole. I'm Rukmani Bhatia. I'm the Advocacy and Legislative Director at Americans for Financial Reform, and I will be the moderator today. Today's briefing is part of the What We Know About the Tax Fight series. You can watch our previous briefing about taxing CEO pay and stock buybacks on our YouTube channel. The link is going to be dropped in the chat in a moment. Today's briefing is focused on closing the carried interest loophole, which is a tax dodge that allows ultra-wealthy private equity executives to enrich themselves. These executives get a preferential tax rate and often pay a lower tax rate than what nurses, teachers, firefighters, and many other people in our communities pay on their salaries. We're going to dig into the details with some experts and also talk about opportunities to close this tax loophole with our set of excellent panelists here today. Before we get to them, we're going to start with some housekeeping. We deliberately chose for the format for this briefing to be a meeting, not a webinar, so that it could be interactive. We will have Q&A and we welcome all of your questions, but we do ask that comments and questions stay constructive and on topic. If we have to, we will remove disrespectful commenters from the conversation to ensure that this is a safe and educational environment for everyone involved. We're going to accept questions in the chat as we go forward. You're welcome to just type them into the chat. The briefing is being recorded so that those who don't attend are able to watch it, as well as for those of you who attend, if you wanted to rewatch it or check in on a specific thing, you have that as a resource. We're going to anonymize your question, so what's posted in the chat will not have the author or the questioner's name. If you want to remain completely anonymous, feel free to DM your question directly to me. We do want this to be a safe space for people to ask questions and learn about this important tax issue. Housekeeping aside, now we're going to turn to the fun part. We're going to get perspectives from experts on the call today. We're going to start with John Foti from Americans for Tax Fairness. Then we're going to turn to Kaitlin Johnstone from Senator Tammy Baldwin's office, Bob Lord from the Patriotic Millionaires, and then Megan Stockhausen from the American Federation of Teachers. So to start, John Foti, take it away.
Thanks so much, Rukmani, and thank you all for being here this afternoon, especially with so much coming you and your office's way. We really appreciate the time to talk a little bit about carried interest and why this is such a vital issue in the tax space to be focused on as we think about what positive tax reform could look like. So just to back up a little bit and to review the reason why we're all talking about taxes right now, which is the expiration of many individual and business provisions from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which are set to expire at the end of the year, and which Republicans have made their primary legislative objective this year is to renew those tax cuts as well as potentially expand some other provisions of that law. So in 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act at the time costed $2 trillion in order to be able to enact. And just to say that cost is on the deficit impact side, not on the total cost and taking out things that were paid for through revenue raisers. But, you know, Republicans, when they passed their 2017 law, claimed that their tax cuts would benefit the middle class. Kevin Hassett from the Council of Economic Advisors at the time had said that most households would see anywhere between $4,000 and $9,000 in increases in their take-home pay. But that did not materialize. On average, the top 1% of earners received a $61,000 tax cut. The top 0.1% received $250,000 in a tax cut, and the bottom 60% of families receive less than $1.25 a day, barely close to $400 if you add that up a year. And we also know that a lot of people also saw their taxes increase in 2017 as well. And of course, after slashing the corporate rate, which was the centerpiece of the 2017 law, from 35 to 21%, companies went on a massive stock buyback spending spree, giving their executives huge bonuses, while workers' wages remained largely flat. And Republicans had also promised that small businesses would benefit from the tax law. However, the top 1% of business owners received over half the tax benefit of the provisions they claim would benefit small business owners when finally enacted. And of course, extending this law will be even more expensive than it was 8 years ago. If made permanent, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act would reduce revenue by, at a minimum, $4.5 trillion over the next 10 years. Over half of, or nearly half of which would go to households, corporations, and individuals with incomes over $400,000. And so all this to say, when we're talking about things like the carried interest loophole, which did see some modest changes that Bob is going to talk about in a second, this is really emblematic of provisions in the tax code that are legal loopholes that exist that continue to siphon off billions in tax revenue yearly to the wealthy, to executives of major private equity firms, while depriving our communities of critical resources and the ability to support other programs. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob Lord to talk a little bit more focused on carried interest specifically. And Bob, sorry to interrupt you, but you're on mute.
Thanks, John. I wanted to make sure my dog didn't bark while other people were speaking. Carried interest loophole really is the intersection of three of the worst loopholes in the tax code. So let me introduce those. The first is simply the preferential rate that's afforded to long-term capital gains. Instead of being taxed at the maximum rate on ordinary income of 40.8%, they're taxed at a maximum rate of 23.8%. Let's call that the capital gains rate loophole. The second one that I'll call the tax-free compounding loophole is that gains on investment assets are not taxable until the asset is sold. And the power of this loophole, I think, is underappreciated. If somebody holds stock, and typically it's a very rich person, holds stock for, say, 20 years, and it's appreciating at, say, 20% per year, which is not unheard of. Berkshire Hathaway has been going up at 20% per year for 40 years. So is Microsoft. When you do the math, the annual rate, the effective annual rate of taxation can be as low as 5% or even lower. So that 23.8% that nominally applies to long-term capital gains is actually an overstatement of the actual rate. And then the third loophole I'll call the partnership tax flexibility loophole. And that's where a partnership can allocate income of the partnership to any partner. And it's fairly simple to have that allocation be respected for tax purposes. Really, all that has to happen is the allocation has to have a real economic effect at some point down the line. So if a partner is allocated income, that has to translate into an economic benefit, typically a cash distribution, at some point in the future. So we'll call this the partnership flexibility loophole. And what the carried interest loophole really is, it's the use of this partnership flexibility loophole to allow fund investors to share the benefits of the capital gains rate loophole and the tax-free compounding loophole with their fund managers. And the avoidance strategy to exploit the loophole is really simple. It's just allocating a share of capital gains from fund investments to the fund manager as part of the fund manager's compensation package. So the end result is that the lion's share of compensation that is paid to fund managers is taxed at the rate of long-term capital gains instead of at the rate that ordinarily applies to compensation for services. And the fund manager gets the benefit of the tax-free compounding loophole as well, where there's no compensation for income tax purposes until the investment asset is actually sold by the fund. But it doesn't even stop there, because there are other loopholes that are sort of adjacent to the capital gains loophole. Take stepped-up basis, for example, where untaxed investment gains are wiped out at death. That's largely a product of the tax-free compounding loophole because there's not tax being paid year by year. So if a fund manager dies, his share of the gains, what really is compensation for services, goes untaxed. Another one is Section 1202 of the code, which allows investment gains from investments in small businesses, small at the time the investment is made, to go completely untaxed. Venture capital funds often invest in corporations that will qualify for this exemption. The fund manager can also have compensation exempt under that section. And that's basically the gist of what's happening with the carried interest loophole. There are two bills to close the loophole. One has been introduced by Senator Baldwin, another by Senator Wyden, and I'm anticipating that Kaitlin Johnstone is going to introduce the bill from Senator Baldwin, so I won't go into that now. And I think I'm supposed to turn it over to Megan Stockhausen.
Sure. Thanks, Bob. So, it's an absolute pleasure to kind of be here today and just to kind of start us off. I think it's good to kind of look at what private equity is. It's a term that folks use a ton, but it's often easy to lose sight of what what it actually means. So private equity firms invest in companies that aren't publicly traded with the goal of increasing their value and ultimately selling them at a profit. We've seen over the years a couple of patterns emerge, though. So one is using money from investors to purchase the companies. Generally, the private equity firm, is not using a lot of its own capital. Instead, they invest capital from institutional investors like pension funds and university endowments. Another feature of private equity deals is the use of debt to leverage and complete these deals. Again, rather than invest their own money in these deals, private equity firms take out giant loans, often using the assets of the very companies that they're trying to purchase to acquire the loan. And what we see when they do this is that the companies take on crushing debt and are ultimately kind of hurt in the process. So we have private equity firms investing other people's money to purchase companies and using leverage. How do they make money then? What happens is that the private equity firm makes money by supposedly making these companies more efficient. But really often what they're doing is not a matter of superior management. It's about laying off workers, slashing benefits and pensions, and cutting costs. These three things together often lead to bankruptcy. So the real way that private equity firms make their money is by charging astronomical fees. And pension funds, like the ones that our members are invested in, bear the brunt of these high fees. And then to make matters worse, if the business model wasn't flawed enough, the fees that these private equity firms take in from institutional investors, they benefit from special tax treatment that Bob outlined, specifically the carried interest tax loophole. Together, these are this climate that private equity firms operate in, and the preferential tax treatment that they receive leads us to a place where private equity managers end up being extraordinarily wealthy. For us, for the AFT, we really see the abuses of the private equity industry in two ways. Our 1.8 million members participate in participate in public pension funds. These public pension funds, on average, 15% of their portfolios are invested in private equity. So the private equity industry in many ways is reliant on public pension funds like the ones that AFT members are invested in. We have serious concerns about an industry that charges high fees to pension funds. We also have serious concerns about an industry like private equity that wreaks havoc on so many sectors of the economy. What we see is that these pension funds typically take 20% of any profits that they generate. And this 20% is called carried interest and gets the preferential tax treatment that we're discussing today under the carried interest loophole. We have done a ton of research over the years showing that as we've seen private equity grow in its share of the economy and grow in the share of wealth that it represents, pension funds haven't benefited from the rise in private equity. So, what we're seeing a ton of private equity investment in the healthcare sector, and AFT is the second largest healthcare union in the country. And it's been disastrous there. I know a ton of you are probably familiar with the private equity crisis in the Steward Healthcare and Prospect medical holdings from this past year. Definitely encourage you to look into that. It's absolutely devastating for patient care and for the healthcare professionals in these systems. And it's a trend that we don't want to see replicated across our healthcare system. So with those examples, let me pass it along to Kaitlin.
Thanks, Megan. So I will talk a little bit about my boss's bill that she has introduced called the Carried Interest Fairness Act. And just setting the stage, as the tax code is written, private equity investors and hedge fund managers can classify much of their income as long-term capital gains, since many investments are held for a number of years. And so, as Bob noted, the carried interest loophole allows investment managers to pay the lower 23.8% capital gains tax rate on income received as compensation rather than the ordinary income tax rate of up to 40.8% that they would pay for the same amount of wage income. So last month, Senator Baldwin, she introduced the Carried Interest Fairness Act, which would amend the Internal Revenue Code so that carried interest compensation would be taxed at ordinary income rates and treated as wage income subject to employment taxes. The bill has been around for a while now. Senator Baldwin has introduced the legislation every session since the 114th Congress. She's also offered it as an amendment on different occasions, including during the 2017 tax bill debate. She offered it, and all Senate Democrats supported, but unfortunately, it was not accepted. We've never had a House companion for the bill until this Congress, so we were really excited to work with Representative Perez, who introduced the House companion bill as well last month. And currently, just speaking about the support that we've gotten on the bill, AFG, AFSCME, CWA, AFT, the Alliance for Retired Americans, Patriotic Millionaires, 2020 Vision, Main Street Alliance, Public Citizen, Small Business Majority, Economic Policy Institute, AFR, Take on Wall Street, Community Catalyst, and then the National Women's Law Center are all supporters of the bill. So we've been able to work with groups for a number of years who have continued to support, and we're really appreciative of that. And just speaking of quickly current co-sponsors that we have on the bill, we have Senators Van Hollen, Murray, Schatz, Markey, Klobuchar, Kane, Merkley, Reed, Hirono, Warren, Sanders, Booker, and Welch. So a pretty good list of Senate Democrats. We always would like to grow that list, as well as see if there's any appetite from the Republican side to work with us on this effort. It hasn't been mentioned, I don't think yet, but the same day that we introduced the Carried Interest Fairness Act was the same day that President Trump came out and said that he is supportive of closing the loophole. We're waiting to see how that plays out in Congress and seeing if there is Republican support on the Senate side for this effort. So with that, I will turn it over to Rukmani.
Great. Thank you to all of our panelists. Now we're going to turn it to questions. As a reminder, questions will be anonymized, so please feel free to type them into the chat. If you want to be completely anonymous, please send them directly to me. To start, I wanted to open it up to our panelists. Is there anything that you think was missed previously that you wanted to raise? Otherwise, I have more specific questions.
Rukmani, actually, there is something I forgot to mention that I would just like to raise, which is, all of this that we're talking about is specifically carried interest, falls under, the tax gap and the amount of revenue we fail to collect every year as a country, despite the fact that this money is obligated. And so, again, while it is hard to totally accumulate all the money that we know is lost and should be paid. It's also legal loopholes like this that also would create that amount even further if we calculated them together. So that tax gap sitting at $606 billion now, with cuts to the IRS and even further, dismantling of Treasury and IRS, that gap is likely to grow even further. So, this is one of those provisions that we can look at to sort of lower the amount of money the government is failing to collect. But again, legal loopholes like this that create tremendous loss in revenue only put the country at a disadvantage fiscally, but also in being able to make future investments in important industries and in workers as well.
Great, thank you for that. So there has been reporting, including in the New York Times, that the private equity industry has lobbyists on Capitol Hill making the case that private equity firms are big job creators. I'm curious if our panelists have any thoughts. Megan, if you had any thoughts on how to respond to that.
Yeah, I feel like they're gaslighting us, right? Like layoffs are core to the business model, we see them at the AFT, we see them go into hospital systems already struggling with nursing shortages and fire nurses. So it's, these are really not claims I give any grain of salt. Mass layoffs are just how they make money fundamentally.
John, is there anything you wanted to add to that question?
Yeah, absolutely, Rukmani. One thing I want to flag for folks, and here I'm about to drop the link in the chat. Americans for Tax Fairness, along with Americans for Financial Reform, our friends at Private Equity Stakeholder Project, and some other organizations released a report called Private Equity Public Damage. And we really looked at, how private equity companies, not just recently, but through the decades, have really been leaning in on this practice of buying up companies, breaking it down to spare parts and then selling off what they can. And just to say, I would really encourage folks to read through that report because it will also give you a lot of historical examples while also showing how TCJA is making this problem worse. One of the more prominent examples we talk about in the report is actually Toys R Us and the collapse of, just to say from my childhood, what was an institution, but, was bought up by a private equity firm, KKR and Bain Capital, and they ran it into the ground. And that was specifically designed to do so then it could be sold off to other companies. And then, of course, regardless of what happened to those workers, they could reward their executives with huge bonuses. And their executives certainly were not the ones who bore the brunt of those bankruptcies as well. And just to say, when you look at what the administration is undertaking now, after reading through this report, Doge in and of itself is a private equity style takeover of the federal government. They are doing the same tactic that they have in the private industry, in which they come in, they conduct massive layoffs, they break everything down to their spare parts, and then they look for the opportunity to privatize some of those functions and then be able to make a profit off it in a separate industry or in a whole new business in and of itself. So, what is happening right now from Doge is not a coincidence, but also it follows a very similar frame of other things. And in the report, you'll also find numerous examples of how products and services have been whittled down to from their original intent in their original formation, and have been reduced basically to profit mechanisms for wealthy executives. Really big thanks to our partners for partnering on that report, but just continuing to emphasize that this is something that does not create jobs, does not lead to economic growth. It only ends up reducing many of the institutions in our economy to dust.
Great, thank you both.
If
Um,
I could just jump in here for a second.
Sure.
You know, let's not get distracted here though, because we're not closing the carried interest loophole or trying to close it because of what private equity does or doesn't do. We're trying to close it because it's just wrong for one class of individuals, fund managers, whether they're in private equity or venture capital or real estate, to be paying income tax at an absurdly low rate compared to anyone else. And we're talking about some folks with annual compensation of $1 billion sometimes. So even if private equity were doing a world of good, it would be the investors and their money that was doing the world of good. It wouldn't justify taxing these fund managers at a low rate. Because really, I think you can make the argument for venture capital and real estate a little bit better that they are actually doing some good. But that still doesn't justify the tax treatment that their fund managers are receiving.
Thanks for that. I wanted to flag in the chat, several resources have been shared, including the report that John mentioned, the companion bill to Senator Baldwin's Carried Interest Fairness Act for the House side, and then also several reports from AFT related to private equity in labor, health sector, and healthcare. Megan, I'm curious if the carried interest loophole was closed or if there was more comprehensive legislation to address the harms of private equity, like the Stop Wall Street Looting Act, that were enacted. How would that impact the lives of your members, of teachers, of nurses, and other healthcare workers in your union?
That's such a good question. So, our the educators that AFT represents, they are always, highlighting like the needs, right, and the fundamental underinvestment that we see in public education. So I can point to dozens of examples of school infrastructure that really needs investment, because kids should be able to go to school in facilities that are safe and modern. Everything from services for kids with special needs to lower teacher-student ratios to investments in career and technical education. Education just is underinvested in, and anything that we can do to generate more revenue that we could possibly put in pre-K through 12 education or higher education, or our healthcare sector. We're in a political reality where cuts to Medicaid are being discussed, right? There's no justification for, as Bob said, treating a very, very wealthy subgroup of investors to a tax rate that's much, much lower than the average teacher or nurse's tax rate. There's just the needs are too great, and I personally think this industry just, there's no justification for it. It is not. As you can tell from the resources we've shared, this isn't an industry that you can point to and say, wow, they're doing so much good for society. So there's just so many reasons why they shouldn't have such preferential treatment from our federal tax system.
Great, thank you. Race has played a very significant role in our tax code since its inception, from poll taxes and issues in Reconstruction where there were violent attacks on politicians of color, where tax rates went up 25% for each additional dollar of tax revenue collected. There has been a regressive tax system. And we have seen a dramatic reduction at the same time in taxation for the rich and for corporations, which has only helped to widen the racial wealth divide, enormously. I'm curious, John, I know that there has been a recent report that your organization did related to the racism in the tax code. Are you able to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, thanks, Rukmani. And this is such a critical aspect of the way the tax code has different preferences, and how sometimes those preferences end up exacerbating inequalities that already exist in the system. So billionaires, most of whom are exclusively white, can go years without paying taxes because our system isn't set up to properly tax huge wealth or the income that flows from it. Just to say, a billionaire or someone who is making their income primarily from capital gains is usually paying a less rate, not only because of their income tax, but also because they're not paying a large portion of payroll taxes that end up being a larger share of a worker's income than they do a millionaire or a multimillionaire investor. But capital gains income, the profit that's generated when an investment becomes more valuable than its purchase price, is taxed at a far lower rate than work income. Income you get from actually performing a job or a service or working for an employer and receiving a W-2. Um, the top capital gains rate is 20%, while the top rate on work income is 37%. And the vast majority of this preferential treatment, 92% of so, flows to white households, even though they make up only 2/3 of taxpayers. Meanwhile, the wealthiest of investors are able to even avoid that 20% tax on their investment income by using various legal loopholes as well. And so what this means is that a white millionaire investor or hedge fund manager can pay a tax rate barely half of what a black lawyer or doctor or teacher is paying when it comes to their income and how they receive their income through their work. So again, as Bob noted, regardless of the substance of the private equity company or what the hedge fund manager is doing, the fundamental question here is fairness and whether or not a hedge fund manager should be entitled to paying a lower tax rate than a teacher. And from our research and from everything we found, is just an inequity that perpetuates already existing inequities in the tax code.
Thank you. Megan, I'm curious, how does the private equity model that this carried interest loophole subsidizes, from your perspective, how does it contribute to the racial wealth divide?
Yeah, I mean, just to build on what Foti shared, 98% of private equity managers are white men. So it's just really clear who's left out of this very small, high earning subset of American taxpayers. It's worth noting that a lot of these private equity fund managers use their wealth for political influence. Like they're donating to candidates on the right. They're pushing a anti-DEI agenda. Like they are investing in the private prison industrial complex that drives mass incarceration. I think it's also worth noting that private equity historically has had a large presence in retail, and the retail jobs are predominantly held by women of color. And in that sector, private equity has driven down wages. So it's, you don't have to scroll far down the list of donors, of MAGA political donors, to find a large private equity presence. So I do think that that's something worth thinking about as we think about the tax structure and ways to reform it.
Thank you. And then for any of our panelists, why is it important for our tax policy to close these legal loopholes?
Well, I think it's the perception that the public has that's so important to maintain and have it be a perception of fairness rather than that the system is rigged. When ordinary people working for a living, making, a modest income, say $70,000 a year, see that they're paying tax at as high a rate as a fund manager pulling in $1 billion a year, the feeling of unfairness that they get is harmful to society. And I think that's more important than the revenue. When you look at the revenue estimates for closing the carried interest loophole, they're not huge. The problem is more of what's the fairness of it all, how egregiously undertaxed these fund managers are compared to anybody else who's working for a living. A doctor, you know, after going to medical school and making the sacrifice of doing that, making, say, $1 million a year, is paying a substantially higher tax rate than one of these fund managers, even though making sometimes 0.1% the income that the fund manager is making, $1 million versus $1 billion. So it's, in my mind, the revenue the revenue matters, but it's almost beside the point because the unfairness is just egregious.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, Bob, that, on the other fairness argument, there's nothing like this available to someone who's making $50,000 a year. There's no loophole that allows them to reduce their the amount of tax they owe by 17%. And so it's not just about the perceived fairness and what I have and what they have. It's also about the fact of this also enables additional loopholes to be created. It enables inequities in the economy, and it also creates a harder job for Congress because now when it comes time to write new tax policy, we have to clean up these obvious gaps rather than focusing on new ideas or new things that might be able to actually spur longer term economic growth, support workers, support families. And so really, this in many ways, these loopholes distract us from other really important policies and ideas that we could be enacting to support a broader base of folks across the country rather than having a specific loophole that only benefits a handful of individuals.
Great, thank you. Now, the Carried Interest Fairness Act is quite complex legislation. I'm curious, Kaitlin and others, if you're able to talk through why it's so important for the legislation to have the different provisions it does and why it is so complex to close this carried interest loophole.
Sure. So it kind of has to be complicated, I guess. We want to make sure that what we are proposing is what is actually in the text of the legislation, whether that's getting technical assistance from different parties to make sure that what is said in our bill is actually what how it will be interpreted by the executive branch. If it were to pass, that's something that we want to make sure is taken care of with our bill. On top of that, it's existed for a very long time. Given that it's been since the 114th Congress, we've received a lot of feedback and there have been changes made, certain technical changes made over time. The public has seen it for a long time, our stakeholders have seen it for a long time. And if there are, updates that need to be made to the bill, in order to reflect what my boss is trying to do with actually closing the loophole, we want to make sure it would actually be closing the loophole. So, we rely a lot on different stakeholders, the ones on this call, others that I mentioned earlier in the call, to also look at the legislation as well.
If I could just expand on that a little bit, what's really going on here when you think about it is, going back to how I introduced it, we have these three loopholes that are creating the carried interest loophole. And what you have to do in the bill is close these loopholes, but only as they apply to fund managers. So you're not closing the capital gains rate loophole for everybody. You're closing it only for fund managers. So that the drafters of the bill, legislative counsel, they have to identify, for example, every place in the tax code where capital gains are treated differently from ordinary income, and include in the bill that fund managers aren't entitled to that preferential treatment. And it's a lengthy process. And fortunately, I don't know how many here have worked with legislative counsel. They're really extraordinary. They find things that I would never think of when they're drafting these bills where it can have an incidental impact. Because if they miss one, then some clever tax lawyer out there is going to figure out how to exploit that oversight to create yet another loophole.
Kaitlin, I'm curious, what is the best way for folks on this call, if they're interested, to follow up with you more, either to co-sponsor the bill or just learn more about the bill?
Yeah, of course. Via email, happy to put it in the chat. It's the best way to reach me regarding the bill. Happy to talk through any questions. We get a lot of questions on this bill, so happy to talk through it, as well as if your boss is interested, happy to add them on as a co-sponsor.
And then one technical question. Will there be any restructuring of fund partnerships if the carried interest loophole was closed?
I think there could be. The corporate rate of tax is 21%. So I could see where fund managers will lodge their interest in a fund in a corporation. So it will be taxed at 21% rather than the top ordinary income tax rate for individuals. They'll have a challenge of later bringing that income out of the corporation where it would be taxed again as perhaps a dividend. But they can delay a lot. They could wait, possibly 10 years between the time that the fund interest was paid, the 20% capital gains share was paid to the corporation, and the dollars were moved out of the corporation. And they're just investing this money anyhow, so they could invest it in corporate solution. So I could see where a lot of fund managers will be lodging their share of the fund in a corporation.
Great, thank you. Is there anything we missed or anything anyone on the panel wanted to raise? Or any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Okay, hearing none, we really appreciate everyone joining. We know it's a very busy time on the Hill. We appreciate our panelists. Kaitlin, thank you very much. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, John. Thank you, Megan. Like I said at the top, this is recorded, so you will get a recording of it as follow-up. We also will be sharing some resources, including what was dropped in the chat here. And if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you all for your work, and thank you again for joining us on this very busy Thursday.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rukmani.